Porky Pig. Anybody remember
Yes.
Porky Pig?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay, Miss Piggy? Oh, yeah. Oh, the Pig was Wrigley? Getting harder, anybody? How about the Pig War?
Maybe.
One hand, one maybe? Recent heard about it? Okay, good topic. We're going to take you on a little walk back through history and look at the events leading up to the Pig War, and we'll discuss the war itself, and then finally talk about how it was eventually resolved. This is only the most famous war in Pacific Northwest history, guys. It happened right here in Washington State, so you need to know that.
My only question was, is that your thing?
This is my thing.
Okay. Oh.
The first thing that you need to understand is that in the early 1800s, the landscape of the United States as we know it today was very different. I have a little upside-down map. Can everyone see the top one here? In the early 1800s, you have to remember that the majority of the population of the United States resided over here on the East Coast. And a real popular saying that you probably all heard back then was, "Go west, young man." And so people were, by the hundreds, joining wagon trains and heading west to a territory that they called the Oregon country, all the way over here. Now it's, this green area here contains the states of Washington, most of Oregon, most of Idaho, also parts of Nevada and Montana, Nevada, and part of British Columbia. And what this map doesn't show is that there's also a very large island here off the coast of Washington, that's Vancouver Island, which is now part of Canada. And there's several islands that are sandwiched in between. There are about 170 smaller islands in the archipelago, and that's what this map right here is. And another thing that you need to understand is that the United States was not the only one sending settlers to the Pacific Northwest, to the Oregon Territory. The English had already been there for years and years. They had a company back there called the Hudson Bay Company. Rings a bell with anybody? They had been there for a long time trading with the Indians. We also had Indians back there. And the ownership of the Oregon Territory was disputed for more than 40 years, with those countries and those peoples all trying to lay claim to it. Finally, a treaty was drawn up called the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which delineated who would take what territory from England and from the United States. They decided to draw a line at the 49th parallel, if we'll use this again, which runs almost directly down through the center of the island, splitting Vancouver Island on one side, the English side, and then the mainland. And it ran right down through the middle of this purple island here. I don't know if you can see, that's San Juan Island. And it was a little vague in how they, rather than deciding to split the land in half, they chose the boundaries to be at the middle channel of water running through the island. They failed to realize, though, that there were two main channels of water that ran down through the San Juan Island. And people being, by nature, greedy, of course, each one wanted the vast majority of property for themselves. So the United States chose to believe that Harrow Strait ought to be the boundary, since it ran further to the west and would give us possession of San Juan Island. And England, on the other hand, chose to believe that Rosario Strait should be that body of water that they were referring to, so that they would have possession of San Juan Island. And from that point, the race was on for each country to get inhabitants on that island and try and strengthen a claim there. In 1851, there was about 25 American settlers on the island, and the Hudson Bay Company had a fish curing plant started there. And then by 1853, to strengthen their claim, Britain also sent another Hudson Bay Company, headed by a man named Griffin, to start a sheep plant at the south end of San Juan Island. There was a nice area of rolling hills and meadows, and he started a nice big farm, which he called Bellevue Farm, that had about 1,400 head of sheep. They had several crop fields, and he also had pigs on the farm there that they used for food. And the settlers on the island did not live peacefully. By right, the English believed that the land was theirs, the Americans believed that the land was ours, and they did not coexist very nicely with one another. For years and years they squabbled over who was the rightful owner of the land and tried to give the others to leave. By 1859, it finally came to a head, the official starting of what we now call the Pig War, when a pig from Bellevue Farm was found in the potato field of an American farmer about a mile down the road. And apparently this was a regular occurrence, and the farmer, Lyman Cutler, didn't like it a bit, and he had threatened several times to shoot the pig the next time he found it. So on this fateful day, he made good on his word, shot the pig, and then marched himself over to Bellevue Farm to complain about it. And at Bellevue Farm, they promptly tried to have him arrested for criminal trespass and destruction of property. And that, of course, outraged the American settlers who cried out to their government to send military protection. At that point in time, the commander of American military forces in the Oregon Territory was a man named Brigadier General William F. Carney, who was well known for disliking Brits in a big way. But he didn't have the authority to send military in to fight the British at that time. We had a policy against that. We had good peaceful relations with them. He didn't have the authority to do that. So instead, he sent military forces to San Juan Island under the guise that they were to protect the settlers from Indians, who it was okay to shoot at that time. So he sent, on July 27th, Company D of the U.S. 9th Infantry arrived at the island under the command of Captain George E. Pickett, who was another man that was very well known for disliking the Brits and having an ego the size of the Oregon Territory. And the minute that he landed on the island, against his orders, he picked out the most visible section of the southern end of the island, really close, within earshot of Bellevue Farm, and promptly and loudly proclaimed that that was U.S. territory, essentially thumbing his nose that the Brits could do something about it. And they did. The very next day, the Royal Magistrate from British Columbia came down to the island, stood toe-to-toe with Pickett, who was ready for it, and told him that they would be leaving the island. And of course, Pickett pretty much laughed at him and smiled and fully told him that he didn't have authority on U.S. soil. He didn't recognize his authority. So the Royal Magistrate promptly went back to British Columbia and whined to the governor of British Columbia, a man named Sir James Douglas, who was the most well-known hater of Americans I think that the Pacific Northwest has ever seen. He looked at the American settlers pretty much in the same way that I might look at an infestation of cockroaches in my kitchen. So he was outraged and immediately dispatched a Royal Navy gunship named Tribune to San Juan Island. It was captained by Captain Jeffrey Fitzhornby, and his orders were to remove Pickett from the island by force. When the Royal Navy officers heard about this, luckily a little later on that same day, they didn't like that idea of it. They thought they needed to be a little more diplomatic in their dealing with the United States, who were proving themselves to be a pretty strong nation to be reckoned with. So they convinced Douglas to amend his plans and immediately dispatched 2 more Royal Navy ships to catch up with Tribune. They found her docked off, or not docked, but I guess it would be anchored off San Juan Island, getting ready to go nose to nose with the Americans, and told him that his new orders were to attempt to remove Pickett from the island, but just through intimidation, without force if at all possible. So a meeting was arranged, and on August 3rd of 1859, the 2 leaders, Hornby and Pickett, met on San Juan Island, and of course the Brits told him to go, and he said, no, we won't go, and Hornby was pretty much helpless to do anything about it, having orders not to use force. So he went back out to the 3 ships that were anchored offshore and sat and waited for his commanding officer, the Admiral of the Royal Forces in the Pacific, who was supposed to be underway to his location. Fortunately, this gentleman, whose name was Admiral Burns, had a little more common sense and a little smaller ego than a lot of these other people involved, and decided that he was going to follow the Royal Navy procedure and not just send them in to annihilate the Americans because of some squabble over Pitt. He instead sent 2 more Royal Navy ships to join their forces off the coast there of San Juan Island and await some kind of diplomatic measures that would finally bring a closure to the whole state event. In the meantime, the Americans are waiting for reinforcements of their own and started arriving on August 10th. A steamer ship named Julia came in carrying about 64 more men, which pretty much doubled the size of the American force on the island. And it also brought with it Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey, who assumed command for Pickett, who was reassigned somewhere else. He had somewhere else to be. And then a couple of weeks later, on August 31st, the USS Massachusetts arrived, carrying additional men for the Americans, as well as about 8 more cannons, which were wheeled up to camp before the Americans left. And for those of you that haven't been keeping score at this point in time, if you're looking at the English camp, if you're going to do the English, here's 1 ship, 2, 3, 4, 5 ships, all off the shore of Little San Juan Island, and those ships are carrying a total of 176 guns on about 2,140 troops, not individual men, but troops, on these ships off the shore of San Juan Island. The Americans in their little encampment by that time had a total of 461 men with 14 cannons. So it's kind of like David facing Goliath here, so we weren't budging. Fortunately, somewhere in that time, the American president, James Buchanan, heard news that there might be something amiss in the Pacific Northwest, and immediately launched an investigation, sending this man, General Winfield Scott, on a 6-week journey by steamer over to the Pacific Northwest. When he arrived and began to investigate, he arrived in Port Townsend on October 25th of '59. The very first thing that he did was figure out that Harney was not a nice man, having sent military forces in to fight Indians. And so he was immediately, publicly, officially rebuked, and then was pulled from his post and reassigned somewhere else. Then he began negotiations with Governor Douglas of British Columbia and arranged for a token force from each military to remain on San Juan Island and set up posts on San Juan Island, and for all other troops to be pulled out until some kind of an official resolution to the whole mess could be arrived at. So that was the beginning of a joint military occupation on San Juan Island. Where'd he go? Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey and his men were removed from the island and replaced with fresh troops. All of the naval ships except for one left to the island. That one stayed until a permanent encampment could be set up. On March 21st, the British set up a camp at the north end of the island, a place that's now become known as Garrison Bay, several of the buildings of which are still standing today. And at that point, once that camp was manned, then the last naval vessel withdrew from the island. And military occupation of the island in full swing, those men's job was to stay there and keep the peace and hold their own ground and their own rights for their country until some kind of a resolution could be met. Joint occupation of the island altogether lasted for 12 years. Not a couple weeks or a couple months, but 12 years while their governments tried to come up with some kind of a resolution as to who actually owned the island. And on the behalf of the American government, I have to say that during the early 1860s, there was a little something else going on to preoccupy them. So our little problems were not the biggest ones that they had on their plate at that time. There was something, small difference of opinion going on called the Civil War, that you might recall from your history book, that they were dealing with during the early 60s. So that having been put aside somewhere around 66, they finally turned their attention back to little San Juan Island and still could not come up with any kind of an official resolution, each side still wanting to lay their claim to that. So, excuse me, I'm losing my voice again. They finally agreed to turn to an outside arbitrator to solve their problems. In 1871, with the signing of the Treaty of Washington, they agreed to turn the matter over to Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany and let him come up with some kind of resolution. And he pondered the matter for a long time. He heard testimony from both sides. He saw evidence from both sides as to why they thought that the claim should be theirs. And he also assembled a special panel of professionals and experts in the field, in several different fields from all over Germany, to help him resolve the matter. He finally did reach a decision and proclaimed in 1872 that the official boundary should be at Harrow Strait, the large strait further to the west, which officially gave ownership of San Juan Island to the United States. A little later on that month, the Royal Marines took their flag down and withdrew from the island, but not until after they had chopped up the flagpole into about 100 pieces, which their men took home as souvenirs. And U.S. military occupation of the island lasted an additional 2 years until 1874, when the last American troops were withdrawn finally from the island. And the rest, as they say, is history. So now you've seen a timeline of the events leading up to the Pig War, and then the event itself. You've seen how it came to be that a pig would play the role of the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, and you've seen how the whole mess was finally resolved. All told, the Pig War lasted for more than 13 years, and during that time, several soldiers that were stationed on San Juan Island did die, but none of them at the hands of the enemy, and none as a direct result of the conflict. So the history books have become very fond of saying that during this war, the only casualty was the pig. Does anyone have any questions?